Hey, I'm Alex Fox, and as we get started here on the second slide, you may be wondering if there even is such a thing as deaf culture. Well, according to the Webster Dictionary, culture is defined as the behaviors and characteristics of a particular social, ethical, or age group. Now, I wouldn't define being deaf as social. It has nothing to do with being ethical or even your age. Being deaf is just that. You can't hear. But the deaf community does share similar characteristics. For example, in some deaf communities, they have schools specific for the deaf community. And the deaf culture even share the same form of communication: sign language. On slide 3, you'll see the American Sign Language alphabet. Sign language is a nonverbal form of communication that uses the speaker's hand movements and facial expressions. Here in the U.S., the deaf community uses ASL, or American Sign Language. But just like verbal communication, sign has different languages in other countries. Like France, for example, they use French Sign Language, or LSF. Also, just like verbal communication, sign can use slang or even have accents depending on which region you are from. But sign is not the only forms of communication among the deaf. Some people can lip read. As we begin slide 4, learning to lip read can be very difficult, and it's even proven to be more challenging if the individual was born deaf. According to Goss in his research paper, he states, "In reality, even with 12 to 15 years of speech therapy, lip reading is a difficult skill to master for people who become deaf in the early years of life. By example, 7 years of age. By then, they would have had a good knowledge of the sounds of the spoken language." But, according to Montagna, the milder the loss of the person's hearing, or the older the person is at the time of hearing loss, the more likely the person is to develop useful lip reading skills. On the next slide, you'll see within the deaf community they face many more challenges than within the hearing community. The deaf community seem to be more blunt with communication, and they also take more time when speaking, whether it be to the hearing or a fellow signer. When having a conversation in sign, the deaf community like to take their time. They like to interact with fellow signers, and long hellos and goodbyes are common. On the next slide, you'll see other challenges are presented to the deaf community. For example, many children which are born deaf are born to hearing parents. This makes communication challenging between the parents and their children. This may result in the child not learning the acceptable forms of social interaction. For example, a deaf person may not understand that it is impolite to be in someone's personal space during a conversation. Or, another example is that the deaf person may not realize that they are interrupting someone during a verbal conversation. You have to realize that if they cannot see you speaking, they do not know you are talking. Even with the use of sign and lip reading, the deaf community still may have difficulties communicating in the hearing world. Luckily, we live in a time where writing and texting and emailing are all accessible forms of communication among the deaf and hearing communities. As we go to the next slide, imagine yourself being immersed in a world where you do not understand the language and they can't understand you. That is exactly what the deaf community has to deal with on a daily basis. They are submerged in the hearing world where their language is not known well. How are these people supposed to communicate? How are they supposed to interact? Overall, there is such a thing as deaf culture. They share similar forms of communication amongst one another. They have organized schools for the deaf community, but they also face challenges with communicating amongst one another and the hearing world, but they always find ways to overcome these challenges.